Hello and welcome to the YouTube podcast series of Citiesabc with Open Business Council, Fashion ABC and Dinner Squadder, where we interview people who are changing the world, people who are inspiring us with their achievements and creativity and acumen with the use of top technology. Now, in previous interviews, Dinner Squadder and I have interviewed over 250 amazing people and achieved more than 15 million views on YouTube. This interview series on Citiesabc is in partnership with our platforms, openbusinesscouncil.org and Web3, the 4AI-based platform utilizing technologies that employ the use of truth and trust through a unique corporate digital identity using blockchain and deployment of data analytics, AI, and machine learning. So today I'd like to introduce you to Martin Butler from Vlerick Business School in Belgium. Welcome, Martin, to our podcast.
Thank you so much, Hilton. I really appreciate you having me here today.
So you work in IT, digital transformation and project management and aligning them with digital investment initiatives. And you specialize in the education component of that, having previously been in an electronic engineer by training and graduated from the University of Pretoria. And then, also, of course, you also did a PhD at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And your career from a developer moved on to you be looking at extensive IT systems. You consulted with companies like Engen, JP Morgan, Computer Associates, KBC Bank, Solco, NV, Dental, and MCB. So tell us a little bit more about your journey in terms of getting there when you were growing up in South Africa.
Yeah, thank you, Hilton. Grew up right in the middle of South Africa, a very rural part of South Africa. My mother fondly recalled me taking apart all technical things and often not putting them back together, more interested in figuring out how they worked and they're not necessarily reassembling them to be able to work again. Went to study electronic engineering at Pretoria University, as you said. And then I did something really interesting. I applied for a mathematics teacher position post at a school in South Africa with an engineering degree. And went and taught mathematics to the school kids. Absolutely loved it because I did not have the educational qualifications to understand pedagogy and all of these big words that you need to teach kids. But I could show them the application of mathematics. I realized that was not my long-term place in the school system. Started working in the technology industry. Software development, to this day, I appreciate having a solid grounding in software development because it gives you the ability to speak to technical people, to understand some of the challenges that people that would be building metaverse and developing code or sitting through. And then after about 15 years of progressing from development to really business analysis and project management, I made a transition into academia, and I transitioned from the IT industry into academia. The intent at that stage was partly driven by my young family. I was managing projects throughout Africa and the United States as well, so I traveled a lot, and I wanted to spend more time at home. But the business school community tend to be international, so I joined academia, and I continue to live my passion and be privileged to teach and work in many places in the world.
So where was the school in South Africa that you were teaching at? Was it near Cape Town?
Just outside Pretoria, Bronkhorstspruit.
Bronkhorstspruit, I know.
Bronkhorstspruit. Yeah, a small little town outside of Pretoria. They took a leap of faith. I will always remember sitting in an interview together with people that had degrees in mathematics and a higher education diploma, and I thought I'd lost my marbles, which I probably did. But I do think it instilled a passion in me for transferring knowledge, and certainly the way that I was taught mathematics at school was fairly mechanistic and not really engaging and immersive. And I just think it's a little bit like technology. Technology, all digital technologies can sound exceptionally boring, but it could also be made come alive if you demystify and simplify it to some of the fundamental principles of what it's actually doing.
Yes. I mean, some of the interesting things that I've been looking at what you've done in the past, having that connection with the real world, whether it's in IT or mathematics, and understanding how its real application works in that space, and interacting with people and understanding the people's needs and the user's needs and etc., and then being able to explain and then realize the answer or realize the solution in that space. I think that was a great learning experience for you.
Yes, absolutely. No doubt. I think, especially if you're a faculty member in a business school, Hilton, Philippe, that's with us on the school doing the recording, yourself, and many of the people that you're speaking to, those are the people that you rub shoulders with in business school. And it's a very discerning client. So you're dealing with a client base that if you would just regurgitate to them what is written in a textbook, they would let you know fairly clearly. They would vote with their feet as well. So having applied, having experienced some of the really significant challenges, the challenges of trying to convince people in the boardroom that this is worth throwing money at, the embarrassment of going back to the same boardroom at a later stage and saying that this is not really pan out like we thought, or having a post-project completion celebration and say we've dropped the system. Having experienced all of that certainly gives you the ability to I think, engage with the learner, but then also for the learners to engage back with you, because they would then share the real stories or the real pains, and it makes for fairly interesting conversations in a business school classroom.
So when in 2007 you opted for Stellenbosch University professorship in the digital enterprise management space, what was the sort of the frame of reference you used in order to get that position and then pass that knowledge on as a professor, and obviously the research faculty behind it in terms of IT?
I think for me, at that stage, I just recently did my own studies at business school as well. They always say it like tongue in the cheek, a person has an MBA because they will tell you. But in my own studies, I thought there was a technologically inclined perspective in a business school course. So although I learned a lot in the course, I do feel that it was an IT and an IT management course, and it was dealing with hardware and software and networks and data and all of these things. And it is not typical the challenges that we experience within the boardrooms. And it's not the last thing that's challenging, those things that are really coming back month after month and year after year. So the very first thing that I actually did when I joined is I kind of killed the course on information systems management. I said we don't need a course on information systems management. Which was interesting enough because most business schools in the world either had an information systems management course, which had a textbook around information systems management, or they simply didn't do it at all. They just splattered it across all of the other disciplines. You would deal in marketing with social media, and the operational guys would deal with ERP systems. But we started a new course called Digital Enterprise Management, or Managing the Digital Enterprise. And at the core of the course was, I think, a lot of the work that you guys are doing, just recognizing that all businesses are becoming digital to an extent. It depends on mining industries. Digitalization of their marketing would be completely different from a more modern organization like yourself. But there's an element of digitalization. You have to deal with the people aspect. You have to deal with the operating model. And that took a fair amount of time to embed within the organization, is to say we're not teaching about managing information systems. We are learning about how do we manage an organization when everything that we touch is becoming increasingly digital and digitalized. And also, how do we keep people accountable? Because that, I think, is one of the things that technology people sometimes get away with. We ask for heaps of money, but we're not always all to the same level of accountability that we have to go back and explain what we did with these moonshots. And if you understand as a non-technical or digital manager what it is that technology can do, how we can measure and how we can get accountability and how we can have metrics to actually monitor that. We can do a lot better than many of our modern management challenges in the business world.
Absolutely. I mean, you emphasize, I looked at a lot of the work that you've been doing, and you emphasize, everybody thinks about technology as being quantitative, but effectively you're talking about the qualitative end of the spectrum and the interaction between qualitative and the quantitative elements. And that's a really, really interesting area because they are interactive. They are designed in such a way that to work properly, they need to interact with each other.
Absolutely. Fully agree with that. And I think coming from the quantitative side of things, having a quantitative background, it gives you a credibility when you are speaking about these things to the more quantitatively, technically orientated people. But then recognizing that we are really a complex problem. I would often explain to the students and say, the spectacular failures that reaches the news, like I always think about the baggage handling at Heathrow Airport, where people flew into Heathrow, but they didn't see the baggage for a week or two. It was a systems failure. It was a technical failure. We couldn't understand that there was a quantitative something went wrong there. So these technical failures seem to be normally spectacular. We know about it when a banking core system is going down. But the challenges that occupy 95% of our cognitive reasoning and our ability is the human aspect of this, human behavior, how humans deal with it. How do we get people to buy into what we are doing? I think the metaverse is a prime example at the moment. There's so much negativity around the metaverse that if you're going to walk into an organization, you say, we need €1 to spend on a metaverse initiative, the first 10 reactions is going to be negative. And how do you deal with that? And how do you actually recognize that that's not that uncommon for many emergent technologies at different times in their life cycle over the last 100 years? It was the same was true for artificial intelligence 3 or 4 years ago. Today, if you ask for €1, people will throw €1 million at you because it is on the upside of the cycle. And recognizing those patterns, seeing the patterns, understanding the patterns, and the human behavior associated with the slope that we're on at the moment mean that we can make better business decisions.
I can understand what you're saying, because it's at the end of the day, there's a lot of hype, a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding. Absolutely. But very interesting. One of the things, the papers that caught my eye that you did was, and I recall it's the one-eyed leading the blind. Understanding differences between IT professionals and non-IT staff when creating and managing passwords. That is that core basic thing that is catastrophic if not managed correctly. Can you elucidate a little bit on that? Because I think it's a really, really important thing that we need to touch upon.
Yeah, certainly. It's actually research that I did with my wife, which is also an academic, and we have a lovely cooperation in our research because she comes from computer auditing perspective, and together we've published a fair amount in the broader security domain. But this particular one was interesting research that one of my MBA students did, and the question that he approached me was fairly interesting. He says, we all know about the requirement to behave securely online. We know that. It's well known, and sometimes we would turn for help to somebody. And the typical people that they would turn to for help is the technology function within the business. However, what we established is that the IT teams within business have a very particular mandate. That's not necessarily a security mandate. They may be working on a new ERP system or the business system or whatever the case may be. And although a normal business user would turn for advice, for help me to increase my competence in creating more secure passwords, to the closest IT person, that individual is not necessarily security inclined either. There's normally a very small group within large organizations and the financial services which are really all around the security team, which is the right person to ask. But in broad strokes, and this is now in broad strokes, if the non-IT, if the users within other functional areas would ask the people within the technical areas for assistance on how to do that, they would actually be asking people that don't necessarily know, but because they are wearing that hat, they would attach a high level of value to what they are saying. I would often say that in the business school, if there was a problem with the printer, if the printer would have had an error or it was out of ink or out of paper, they came to the digital lecturer because it is a printer and I do all things digital. And so people have that tendency to approach people in that broad role. And what we tongue-in-the-cheek remarked is, if I'm running out of money, I don't go to the CFO of the company or the financial lecturer and ask him for more money. I appreciate it's my responsibility. But if I need technical help, we would quite often turn to people that are not necessarily in a position to help us, and that sometimes overestimate their own ability to help us.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of online security, you also looked at the key drivers of poor user behavior. and recommendations in terms of the appropriate interventions that the IT team can put in place, basically for that level of resilience and cybersecurity.
It's an interesting and it's ongoing field of research. I think one of the most important things that is kind of a golden thread that's running through our research for a long time is that it is highly individualized. Quite often when we have these security and awareness campaigns, when we do certain things within the environment, we have one goal. We would like everybody to not do this or everybody to do that. However, if you look at the particular user behaviors and what people would do incorrectly, it's normally very different depending on whether I have a cognitive overload because I have multiple online accounts, or whether I have a technical deficiency, I don't know about the existence of password managers, or whether I just don't make a distinction about the underlying value of the asset that I'm protecting, and don't recognize that maybe the credentials for my online service provider should be different from the credentials for my social media. So the biggest challenge there is we first have to establish where the deficiencies are. What is it that is particularly problematic for individuals that they may not know about? And then we have to have appropriate interventions and deal with those users. So, okay. And companies don't do that often. They have these broad strokes, very well intended, but the broad strokes normally just hit a couple of, it's kind of a whack-a-mole, all the moles are jumping at the different, we kind of have one big hammer and then we hit the entire thing, but you need one hammer and you need to whack the mole that's jumping up at that particular point in time.
That's a very interesting way of describing it.
Whack-a-mole.
Exactly.
Just thought about that. I'll use it in the classroom in future.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of technology, obviously, when you started in the technology space, and obviously programming in IT was part of that, what programming languages and that were you having to use in the development process?
Now, Hilton, you shared your birth year with me prior to us starting the call. I'm born 68, so I studied engineering at uni in the late 1980s. So it was very much the early days of our second generation languages. So we really, in terms of my formal education, was Fortran, and we're right down to assembler as electronic engineers. But when I started working in industry, it was mostly with C++ and later a little bit of C# as well. So it was the first really powerful object-oriented languages that we had.
Which really set you up to really be able to understand how technology is being used today, given that evolution.
I'm hugely appreciative of that. I always say that I know I wasn't the best programmer. It wasn't for me the most taxing or interesting things to crack it. I remember I would have colleagues that would work until 9 and 10 in the evening and take immense pride in having one line of code that has solved this particular problem that I would just whack out in 20 or 30 sentences. So I wasn't the best technical programmer, but I built an appreciation for the complexity of creating elegant code to doing it properly. And I think when the whole transition came from the more structured system development lifecycle and the very structured approach to a more agile and iterative world, I was right in the midst of that, and I could appreciate the value contributions of these different worlds. And to this day, I'm really appreciative of having that technical grounding and understanding to an extent what is required to succeed and where the challenges are.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest challenges we're now facing as we move from Web 2 to Web 3 is essentially that we've gone from a very centralized and controlled environment to a very decentralized environment. And that is a huge challenge. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, and I also think it's part of the technology stack that we use. If we look at the technologies and how we assembled and build the technologies and how we thought about building systems, we always thought about systems and building walled gardens, and this system is for these individuals and that system is for these individuals. We forget it wasn't that long ago, really about 8 to 10 years ago, when major computer systems had a huge challenge to speak to each other because they were just never designed like that. So Web 2 was brilliant in making unidirectional, bidirectional, but it was still bidirectional up and down. It wasn't looking to my left and to my right. It was only getting the content out and having curated content from the user group back, but the intent was never for my profile on Facebook to share with my profile on LinkedIn. It simply wasn't feasible. So I think there's an underlying technological challenge, which some of the modern languages most definitely address. If we look at some of the modern languages like Ruby and Python and many of these languages, it tries to, at the architectural level, deal with some of these complexities. But it's really a systems architecture thing. It's about having that open architecture, having that design understanding that although I may be creating this one immersive experience, although I may be creating something over here, the value is not created in this environment, and it's not contained with this environment. I have to have an open mindset to say that you may have created value somewhere else in this Web3 world. You want to bring it into my environment, and how you add value, how you create new value, you would like to transition that into a new world as well. And that's fundamentally different to how we thought for a long time, but I think we've cracked that code. I think the execution of the new world is still happening, but I think at the technical layer, things that was not a common mindset or a frame of reference is definitely now becoming something that you don't have to explain it twice. A developer team or a design team is saying, got it, let's see how we can actually execute.
Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting that the technologies that we have today, quite a few of them now, because of the decentralized nature of it, have their own challenges. But cybersecurity on the individual has now changed because you're moving towards ownership of who you are, ownership of your identity, ownership of your data. That's the direction of travel, which is a complete breakaway from the Web 2 behemoths controlling you as a commodity.
Absolutely, no doubt. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And I think if there's one domain in the Web3 space that may be slightly lagging and that we need to keep an eye on is definitely cyber, and how we deal with the challenges around the cyber and the new challenges. And I think the thing about cyber is that there are always emergent issues. There's things that we know that we're creating. We are creating credentials that are transferable. We understand that. We design for that. But it's only once that we start transferring those credentials and there are different use cases for that and we start using it, that new use cases pop up or new challenges pop up. And then you need to be really resilient. You use the word resilient. We need to be really, really resilient. Spot it, define it, identify it. How do we best deal with that? And I think that's going to be one of the challenges in the immediate future for us in the Web3 world.
I mean, you remind me of our current project where we effectively developed a corporate digital identity for companies and the offices of the companies in Open Business Council, so that we can actually create that environment of trust and communication in the digital space.
Yeah, absolutely.
So going forward, in terms of, we're talking now a little bit about Web3, and you mentioned before metaverse, but I don't want to get onto the hype cycle, but it has its challenges. We're talking about creating digital twins, digital copies of digital environments that are reflections of something in the real world. How do we deal with bridging the gap between that digital world and the real world in a sort of in a technological way?
I don't think we have to bridge the gap, Hilton. I think there's always an underlying business case, a problem. I'm going to take you right back about 12 or 13 years ago in the early days, could be longer than that. A very prominent school in Stellenbosch that you will probably know the name asked me to assist him to roll out tablets to all of the children. And I then asked him, but tell me about the problems. What are the problems that you're trying to solve? And they said, well, maybe the tablet, the battery will go flat. I said, but hang on a minute, that's a problem that you've introduced. It's not a problem at the moment. A tablet with a battery, or the tablets could be stolen, or the kids lose the tablets. And so they gave me this list of problems. And I said to them, not a single one of those problems are problems that currently exist within the education system. You are bringing them into the education system by the introduction of the tablets. So please explain to me again, why do you think it's necessary to take a book out of a backpack and put a tablet in there? What is the value that you will create with that? And in the end, the decision was made not to give the children tablets and to put the ebooks on there, which didn't make me necessarily very popular, but I was very happy with that because I thought there was an absence of what is it that we're trying to solve here. And I think if we look at the immersive environments, and if we look at the whole set of Web3 technologies, when we fall in love with technology, and I'm looking at myself and I'm looking at the mirror, we would often like to find a use case for that, and we want to force that in, and we want to see that. But if you look at your project that you've talked about now, about an identity and a single identity management, I don't know of a single company in the whole world that hasn't struggled with that at some stage in the last 15 years, having different sets of credentials, having to maintain that, having to secure and all of these things. So when you come with a project like that, you're solving a real business problem. And I am not overly concerned about the digital and the immersive meeting the physical world. I think the use cases will emerge. There's enough people that are pushing the boundaries, that are doing interesting things. There's enough things. We've recently had an experience in business school where we give the students virtual reality goggles, and they would sit there and we take them into the metaverse and we teach them everything, and they took them off and they said that was a horrible experience. You know, the first 20 minutes is kind of wow, and then after 20 minutes it becomes not wow, and then after 30 minutes it becomes boring, and after 35 minutes it's like, can I please get rid of this thing? Because we didn't solve any problem. We gave them headsets and took them into an immersive world because they were sitting in one room. Now, maybe if they were sitting, and I've had an experience where I took my students to an automotive factory in an operations course, but I didn't want to show them the metaverse. I wanted to show them a BMW factory and how cars are being made. And then you put on the headset and you go to a factory and you have an immersive experience in the factory. The reality is, if I had the money and the time to put all of them on a plane and fly them to the factory and do a walkthrough to the factory, it would have been a better experience. But it would cost an arm and a leg, and it would take days out of our schedule. I didn't, but within half an hour, at a fraction of the cost, I gave them 50% of the value of a real immersive experience. And I think there's the challenge. If we can find those use cases where the physical and the digital are complementary, where we do something in the digital sphere, because there's not a single student that took off the headset that did not say, now I have a better appreciation of what an operations environment in an automotive factory is looking like, and said, that's what we wanted to teach. We didn't want to teach you about the metaverse. We wanted to teach you about operational excellence in a high-paced, cutting-edge, robotic-enabled manufacturing environment.
No, I understand. I mean, essentially, you've got that interim phase. You've got that mixed reality or augmented reality phase, which I think is that bridging of the gap, where you're adding in layers of information in the real world to augment or secure whatever actions that you're doing.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned the digital twins before. One of my best business cases is Exxaro Mining, a global mining company with huge operations in South Africa. And they worked with McKinsey, and they have these digital twins of all of their plants. And the reason was fairly simple, because the plant is highly complex. It's impossible to get on a helicopter or a drone and see the entire plant, but there's a lot of things happening in the plant. So you have the digital twin, and you can interrogate the digital twin. You can spot certain things that's happening. It's magic to them. The return on investment is significant because they have this digital version of their plant and they know exactly what is happening there. And it could be as simple as I spent the weekend in Zurich with my family. I don't speak German, but I did have the desire for a bratwurst and a cold beer. But I get a German menu. I would pick up my phone. I'm lying. In this instance, was actually my son. My son picked up his phone. He would have Google Translate, and it would augment the menu in English on top of it. For us, at that particular point in time, it solved a problem, and it meant that we got a warm bratwurst with mustard and a cold beer. That's what we wanted. And I think that's why I think augmented reality and mixed reality has got a fantastic use case. There's a really, really fantastic use case already.
Absolutely. But that's a very important evolution, but I think it will become the mainstay of extensive utility, whether in the commercial world or the private world.
Yeah, I think it's a continuum, Hilton. I agree with you fully. I think it's a continuum. I think there are certain things that will go right to the extreme of the continuum, and we will be able to have really immersive, completely digital experiences. There are certain things that we will get right to the left side of the continuum, and we still need to be there for reflective, collaborative exercises. And there's a lot of interesting things in the middle that we will mix the realities in the world.
Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest challenges that we are now seeing in terms of the metaverse is artificial intelligence. And you mentioned artificial intelligence before in another hype cycle. I know it's a bit delayed because it's been around for a while. Both of us being on the mathematics, quantitative side of the business is just highly augmented statistical analysis.
Correct. We've been telling you this for 40 years.
Exactly. Just that the computers now can do it a lot faster.
Exactly.
But just give us your take on how AI and this augmented reality space interact. And a lot of people are panicking about it at the present time. It's going to take over the world because it's got the word artificial and intelligence side by side. Give me a little bit your idea of how useful or destructive this is.
I'm going to give you a slightly longer answer here. You may have seen in the articles. We also have an article. It's with the title "The Robot Ate My Job," a historical perspective on technologically induced unemployment. And what we basically did is we had a longitudinal look at technology, and technologies, really transformational technologies. And we said, so what happened? Did people lose their work? Should we fear artificial intelligence? Is it going to put faculty out of work? Is it going to put people out of work? And it was really, really interesting because what we found from doing a meta study of what researchers have done, it is a huge sample over more than a 60-year period. What we find is that the work are getting transplaced. Now, that's not news to anybody, but there's no evidence of the net amount of work that's actually being decreasing. As the work is being displaced to a higher cognitive level work, we do different things that humans enjoy to do more, that are more challenging, and the mundane gets automated, whether that was an ox replaced by a tractor or a tractor replaced by an automatic tractor or a horse-drawn carriage replaced by a steam train. There's all these technologies that has always meant that if you were really good at plowing with an ox, you were unemployed. But if you reskilled as a tractor driver, you had employment again. And when the tractor started to drive itself, you were unemployed. But if you reskilled as a software developer that writes the software that drives the tractor, then you had employment again. So through the history of humankind, we've seen this reskilling the whole time. Mm-hmm. And I'm hugely excited about artificial intelligence. I think there's a lot of things that are fairly mundane and boring, or things that humans are just slow at doing, that AI can do for us very quickly and with a fair degree of accuracy. But there are still significant limitations in there. And we need to be able to spot those limitations. And I've seen a tendency in universities now to kick back around using artificial intelligence, and I just think that's very short-sighted. I think it's exceptionally short-sighted to kick back against things that our students will in any event use in their work environment. We have to embrace it. I think a skill like AI prompt writing is an incredibly good skill. I have examples that I'm sharing with people. I shared that yesterday in a meeting where I said, I asked the same question, but I just structured the prompt slightly different. And then the AI engine would give me vastly different answers. So if I want to use AI, I need to have the skill to write the right prompts. I need to be able to still interpret the answer that's presented to me. And we've both seen examples of people that would use a calculator or an Excel spreadsheet and give you the biggest bogus number in the world because they simply do not understand the calculation that's being made. However, if you've, in your own time, with your own effort, gone through that, you still did school with log books. I did with log books as well. Remember those days, Hilton?
Yes.
You in the end, you had an answer, but you had a fairly good idea around the accuracy of that answer. And if there's something flawed in the logic, whether it was a logbook or a calculator or an Excel spreadsheet or an AI engine. And I think that's the important thing, that we still need to be able to interpret the results and make sense of the results. Now, the answer I wanted to give you prior to doing all of this is, I had a fascinating discussion with Mark Cortez at Citiesabc Business School in Barcelona last week. And they have a metaverse campus, and it's really interesting what they're doing in the metaverse campus. But he has a really interesting use case where his English is not his first language, as it's not mine, it's Spanish. And he's learning English, and he's practicing the English within the metaverse. So he goes to the metaverse, he has an audience there, and he then lectures in the metaverse. The recording has got an AI engine that analyzes that recording and then tells him about certain words or accents or things that could have been improved. So he uses the metaverse as a platform to be immersive, as I would be addressing the audience, and he uses artificial intelligence as a complementary tool set to create more value and to give me valuable feedback. And I think that the use cases for AI is very clear at the moment, but I think that there's an emergent future where a lot of the value in the Web3 world and many of the interesting things that you guys are busy with as well will have a layer of AI or an interoperability with AI to gain more value and create more sense from what we are trying to do.
I mean, we've been deploying that for a while now. At the end of the day, it's just a very useful tool.
Absolutely.
It gets you from A to wherever you want to go to very, very quickly. And sometimes it's a lot faster and surprises you how quickly you can get there. And also sometimes when you look at it, it asks you to ask the right questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Ask you to ask the right questions. So true. So true.
Because there's something you've missed.
Yeah.
At the end of the day. No, it's a very fascinating time. I mean, it's obvious that there are, we've all, in our time seen how bad actors use technology. So we've got the idea now of deep fakes, we've got the idea of avatars, we've got the idea of AI, making people say things that they normally don't say based on some prescripted philosophy or approach or political view. That will happen anyway, regardless.
Absolutely.
It was happening in the Web 2 environment. It's just now more sophisticated, but it's been happening for time.
Yeah, indeed. There's a lovely book written about this called Future Crimes. And it actually says the bad actors have been with us for 3,000 years. But the technology that they had at their disposal to commit these crimes moved from a stick to a knife to a gun to explosives to and now we've just given them the ultimate tool, and we need to deal with that like we've always dealt with that. The bad actors will be with us, and they would use whatever they have at their disposal to try to commit these crimes.
I mean, the key people in this industry, in the AI industry, got together and signed an agreement to effectively slow things down.
Yeah.
Purely it's because they wanted to catch up from the competition.
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure if all the key actors that is moving the industry forward is signed up to that. I think it's fairly well-known personalities and people that actually want them to slow down. But I have to admit, I share your pessimism in terms of the net impact of all of that. Certainly, they raise the level of awareness, which is always good. But I had a question. I did a presentation a while ago to Vlerick has got an advisory council, and I did a presentation to them what CEOs should know about AI. And in the end, the one fairly senior business leader asked me, said to me, but everybody's worried about this. And he talked about that memorandum that you talked about now as well. And he said, what should we do? What should we do? I said, well, I'm not entirely sure, firstly. But secondly, I pointed to a research group in the Netherlands that's doing some fascinating research to try to regulate AI. So they're doing some really, really cutting-edge research, and they're having fantastic white papers around AI. And their whole intent is to regulate, better regulate AI. So, and then he interrupted. He said, so more regulation is the answer. I said, no, I don't think regulation has ever been the answer. But in our quest to regulate, we need to be able to understand. And if we understand better, we can manage better and we can make better decisions. And I've seen that so often that I don't believe that regulation will necessarily change the environment. There may be elements of regulation, but in our quest to regulate, we have to understand. And there's many things in the AI world that if you ask 99% of people that use AI at the moment, explain to me what has fundamentally changed, how AI has, with the supply chain from data to the model to the question, how these large models that was trained and that was born in Stanford and all of these things, how has that changed? They're completely oblivious to the fact. And the fact that they're oblivious to that means that they don't necessarily understand the power of the engine, but also the challenges and the limitations are sitting within that engine.
I mean, one of the interesting things that you and I are conscious of is that, in the early days of machine learning and the algorithms put in place for these large Web 2 platforms, there were inherent biases built into the algorithm and the data set.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've even learned from that yet, because even in the AI space today, in terms of the algorithms that we are using, who wrote the algorithm, what's the inherent bias in that algorithm, purely through culture, education, whatever, that we are skewing the world towards these biases. How do we deal with this?
I think it's a big challenge, and I think it's even worse than that. We have this tendency that if there is a mechanism that's making this decision, that we would put more trust in that sometimes because of the time that we are living in. So if you would give me a particular perspective, I would ask at Hilton, but maybe you're slightly biased. You are this person, you're doing all of that. So I may be aware of your biases if you provide me with an answer. But if I'm asking a model or a trained data set and I'm asking that, then I tend to put a higher degree of trust in that answer because I'm oblivious to the bias that is actually embedded in there. So I think we may be slightly moving backwards in there. I think it's deeply challenging because there are obvious ways to intervene and to build some logic in to try to counter that. But I think it's the level of complexity that Elon Musk now faced with his purchase of Twitter and wanting to say, but it should be an open platform and people should be able to say everything. And then all of a sudden realize, but hang on a minute, there's certain things that you should moderate. And the moment you moderate is where you draw the line. What do you moderate and what do you not necessarily do? So if we are trying to deliberately interfere with the data set, or if we are trying to deliberately interfere with the model as it's learning from the data set to not embed those biases, where do we pass the value judgment? What is the value judgment? Is it yours? Is it mine? Is it Philippe? Is it the person next door? So I think it's a really big problem, and I honestly have no idea. I do think the fact that you've asked me the question and that if you speak to people at the moment, they seem to be appreciative of these biases. That gives me a little bit of confidence. At least there's the first step of change is always awareness. But the next step is, I'm not entirely sure.
I just go back to my days of when I was managing, we were managing hedge funds, and when we were looking at risk management, if we thought of a particular risk or risk scenario, we had an obligation, because we were managing other people's money, to actually take note, research, and monitor.
Yeah, and we trusted you for that. The whole industry worked because of that obligation that you had. You had the trust of the industry because we knew there was somebody that had their eye on all of this.
Yes. The same thing with this industry. So the more, obviously, people like yourselves and the education institutes, who I think are incredibly important as we evolve going forward. Yeah. The education institutes, I think, have to be, just like journalists are there for making sure that we are that our political governance is open and transparent. I think that the research institutes, the universities, and that have to fulfill the same role and function.
I think so, but I do think it's a collaborative. I think we can only research what is the big challenges that the industry actually tells us, the conversation that we're having now. And our research need to be highly practical, and it need to be research. I think for a long time, there was this tendency to do research which would lead to a publication, would do something amazing. And with people in industry would say, but hang on a minute. No, I know you get different levels of research, and there's primary research, applied research, all of these things. But I think there's a really important future that these things are moving so fast and so quickly that unless we work hand in hand with players like yourself in industry, and we pick up the problems and we direct the research appropriately, it does have a tendency to probably run away from us. And that research may be solving problems really well that industry already solved adequately enough 2 or 3 years ago. We need to move fast, and we need to find mechanisms to move fast. I do see some interesting things. I think it was interesting. COVID was, for example, accelerator. So many of the cutting edge research in COVID had quick publication channels. that really made a difference to the medical fraternity, to healthcare globally, because of the accelerated way in which the information was disseminated. And I do think some of the open access journals are some of the mechanisms. But it's also about, we did that lovely research about the robot ate my job, but we didn't package that as a human consumable 2 or 3 page punchy article. Some of the things that you guys write and you put online, it's just lying in a journal somewhere. And I think that as researchers, we need to breach that gap as well. If we solve problems that need solving, that we get it into management language, and if we disseminate that information, that people actually want to read it and actually want to use it and get it out there. I want to use one example. One of my colleagues is working on a brilliant model to make sense of the metaverse, and he calls it the 4V model. And at this stage, it's kind of one of the best kept secrets within Vlerick. And I think it's absolutely brilliant. And we're using it to design our course now. But I have to ask myself is, why did we not put this in a 3-pager? Put it out there, because every business person out there that need to throw some money in the metaverse would love to see, so these are the 4 things that we actually need to look at. I think as business schools and as an educational space, we have to get better at that.
Martin, that sounds like a great idea. And I'd love to be able to sit down and talk about this with you and be able to share that with the wider audience. It's been a wonderful hour, and thank you very much indeed for your great insights, and very enjoyable. And good luck with the education process, because if I think about it, the people you're talking to today are going to be having an impact on industry for 40 to 50 years going forward. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Hilton, only a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Have a lovely day.
Thank you for viewing and engaging with today's podcast with Martin Butler of Vlerick Business School in Belgium. If you're interested in knowing more about citiesabc.com with openbusinesscouncil.org, do go to our platforms, as well as you can find me on social media and direct message me, Hilton Supra, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And do go to the other interviews we have done on YouTube. And don't forget to like and comment. Thank you very much for your time and engaging with this interview on Citiesabc.